Greetings designers! Today's video is going to be on the elements and principles of design, right? Specifically related to three-dimensional design. And so I'll hear a lot of different people talking about elements and principles of design, talking about them in different ways. Some of the principles apply a little bit different to a two-dimensional object and our two-dimensional image than they might in a three-dimensional object. And so we're going to be talking about them in the context of three-dimensional objects. So, right, the elements of design. Right? The elements of design are basically line, plane, volume, space, and then in addition to that, texture and color. Now I separate that out because this course, three-dimensional design, focuses primarily on line, plane, and volume, and sometimes the addition of space. Right? Beyond that, texture and color we talk about a lot more in the two-dimensional design world. Now they apply to the three-dimensional object, but first we have to get a better understanding of the structure of the object. Right? And then we can treat that surface of the object utilizing texture and color. Right? So we break them up a little bit in that way. For this video and for this particular course, I am though going to be focusing particularly on line, plane, and volume. All right, so let's talk first a little bit about dimensionality. Right? Dimensionality, what does that mean? Right? You hear people throwing around terms like 2D or 3D, or 2D design, or a 2D design course, or a 3D design course. There's always sort of this idea that somehow 3D comes after 2D. Right? But really what it is it has to do with the amount of points that are involved in the thing that we're talking about. Right? So first we have to break that down. Right? You never hear someone talking about 0D, right? No D, or 1D. Right? Those are not things that we commonly sort of talk about. But if you think about it, if you boil it all the way down, right? Zero dimensions, right? Zero dimensions would be a single point, right? One single point. Right? A single point, it's not going anywhere. In its finest, smallest amount, it doesn't have any dimensionality of its own because it's just a single point. Right? So we have one point, that's zero dimensions. Right? If you take that point and you add a second point, right, 1, 2, right, as soon as you have 2 points, you have a line. Right? Even if we don't connect the line, our eye visually draws a line, right, that there's something. So that point could move in space, right? That would be one way that you would move that point along a line, right? Or it could just be two different points that are tethered by something, right? It's the connection between them. So 2 points create a line. All right? If you add a third point, right? As soon as we add a third point, we get a plane. Right? Now the plane is a flat thing, right? So this is the realm of 2 dimensions. So we call the plane the two-dimensional realm. And when you think about the things that you might be learning in a two-dimensional design course, right, you'd be learning about making images on planes. You have to start with the picture plane in order to do that. The best example I can think of, or maybe just the one that I love the most, is the Phantom Zone as it appears in Superman 2, the movie. Right? I can't put a link to that because that's a copyright infringement, but I will add that to BOM. So go check out the imprisonment of General Zod in the beginning of Superman 2, and you'll see a great example of a plane moving through space, and it's also just fun. Excuse me. All right. So we have 3 points. Right? This gets a little bit sort of kind of crazy thing. You have 3 points, and that makes a two-dimensional plane. If you add a 4th point, right, we get three-dimensionality. Right? So here you can see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 points, and all of a sudden we have a three-dimensional object. Right? So with an X, a Y, and a Z axis, right, to sort of define its dimensionality. So multiple planes, so we have that 4th point, multiple planes creates a three-dimensional object. Right? And this is going to be particularly important when you start looking at 3D modeling on digital 3D modeling, where so much of it is focused on triangles and basically planes, right, that we use to make up the three-dimensional object. We'll talk more about that. Fourth dimension, right? The fourth dimension, right? Fourth dimensional reality. So if you think about that object, right? So you take that object, right? Here we have an object, right? This is a three-dimensional object, right? So here's that three-dimensional object sort of just staying here, right? You have to put your arms up to do this, right? As soon as that object starts moving in space, right? So as soon as that object starts moving in space, we all of a sudden have four dimensions, right? Because we have the 3D object moving in space, right? There are other ways that the 3D object can also move. The 3D object can also be stationary, but moving through time, right? So if you have an object moving through time, you would see that object might change. So think about a tree growing, or maybe an old car rusting, right? So if you took a photograph of a car every day for 100 years, you know, what would it look like, right? That would be a stationary object moving through time. We won't get into fifth dimension and whether or not that exists, whether or not there are magic imps there or it's a spiritual realm. I'll leave that for you guys to decide on your own, and you can think about the fifth dimension, right? All right, so that's a little bit about dimensionality, right? So we've talked about the elements of design, right? And now we're going to talk about the principles. I always think it funny that you always hear people say principles and elements of design, but it really should be elements and principles of design, because the elements are the stuff. They're the thing, and the principles are in my mind sort of what you do with those things. Okay, so that's a really sort of simple way of putting it. The principles that we're going to be focusing on in this course are proportion and scale, right? Those kind of are related to each other. Balance, emphasis, right? Repetition and variation, and I always like to talk about those together. They're two separate principles, but I like to talk about them together. And finally, harmony, and harmony as it relates to unity, which is sort of at the end. So let's first talk about proportion and scale. Right? Proportion and scale, right? Elements compared one to another in terms of their properties of size, quantity, and degree of emphasis. Right? So what does that mean? It means how things are relating to each other, right? In terms of their properties of size, quantity, and degree of emphasis. Right? Probably the best example of proportion, right, is Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. Right? So the Vitruvian Man, right, people have been interested in the proportions of the human body for a very long time. So, you know, when we talk about the proportions of the human body, we're talking about being somewhere between, this is a debate, but somewhere between 7 and 8 heads high, right? And most people know, like the Vitruvian Man, when you stretch your arms out, that you are the same number of heads tall as your arm length is. Right? So the proportions, the average proportions of an individual are the same whether that person is, is 5'2" or 6'8". Right? So we all sort of share that. Doesn't matter where in the world your parents or your ancestors are from. We all share that. Right? And so those are proportions. Right? The proportions are those relationships. Scale. Scale is the sort of size of things, right, in relationship to other things. So a great example of that is Claes Oldenburg. Right? You can see a giant clip. Sorry, I'm fumbling on that one a little bit. But Claes Oldenburg plays with scale, and so he makes these things sort of large and out of scale, and we find that to be very humorous. Scale is very important to three-dimensional designers because we make things at a variety of different scales. Right? So you might hear me at other points talking about making a head half scale. Right? So a half-scale head, right, is about this high because this is the halfway point. So that's how big a half-scale head is. Right? A half-scale person would stand about this high, right, because that's about where half is. You might think about, like, when you're talking about everything from, in toy design, HO scale, right, for trains. HO scale is a very specific size as it relates to the a larger thing. You know, action figures, all sorts of different things with scale, Matchbox cars, right? So those are things that the proportions, right, are the same for a life-size figure as they would be for a half-scale figure, right? But the scale is different. All right, so and we'll talk about being able to manipulate and move those things in both directions, whether it's really large, like Claes Oldenburg, or making it really small, like an action figure. All right, proportion and scale. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is balance. Right? Balance is the ordered relationship of parts, whether symmetrical or asymmetrical, right? Equilibrium. All right? Symmetrical balance. Symmetrical balance means equal visual units, right and left, top and bottom of an imaginary center point. Right? So symmetry, right? Symmetry means that things are the same on both sides. Right? We all know that we are symmetrical in the sense that one side of our face, right, is an equal opposite to the other side of our face. Now there's small variations in that. That's what makes us interesting, right? But basically, you know, you have an ear on this side and you have an ear on this side. Those two forms are symmetrical. All right, so that's symmetrical balance. And then asymmetrical balance, right? So asymmetrical balance is visual balance achieved by dissimilar visual units. For example, 2 or 3 small shapes on the right balancing one large shape on the left. Right? So you can have things that appear weighted in certain ways. So another one would be, you can have something that looks really heavy in one hand, but then something else that's larger but looks very light in another hand, and those two things would look like they balanced. Right? So that's an asymmetrical balance. So the things are still balanced. Right? A great example of that is Gustav Vigeland's sculpture here that you can see. These are in Oslo, Norway. Great sculpture park that is on my list of places to visit someday. But this is, you know, it's a fun sculpture, but you can see that there's a balance that's achieved here, right? Even though the figure is all over there. So you can see in the body of the figure, you can see the symmetrical components of that, but then the asymmetrical balance with all the babies all over the place. Right? And then another part in talking about balance is that balance can also mean out of balance. Right? So that's something we also want to think about. If you look at people running, for example, in order to run, basically we lean our body forward and we throw it out of balance. It starts to fall, and then our legs kind of pick up. Right? So that puts us out of balance. Right? So it's not that there's a everything has to be balanced. Right? Sometimes we want to be out of balance. Right? Makes life interesting. All right, the next one is going to be emphasis. Right? Emphasis. Something in the work must dominate. Right? Something in the work must dominate. A high point or climax occurring in the work, or the domination of a motif or a design element. Right? Emphasis is what draws your eye. Right? It draws your attention. Right? You don't want everything in an image or an object or a work of art of any type. You don't want it to be the same everywhere. Right? You want to be drawing the viewer's eye around. Right? So a great example of that is Pluto and Proserpina by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. It's a classic sculpture, but look at the way that the hand sort of grips the flesh. Right? And that adds this intense domination, if you will, as a design element, as it sort of squeezes the flesh there. Right? And when you see this sculpture in person, right, you're drawn to that immediately. Right? So it pulls you around, and it makes that the place where he's telling the narrative. Right? So he's using that to tell that narrative. Fantastic sculpture. Right? Rhythm or repetition, right? And I'm going to talk about this again as in context with variation coming up next. So rhythm is the result of replication, right? So rhythm. Right? Rhythmic devices can include duplication of the same form, right? Two forms used alternately, sort of flip-flopping back and forth, equal opposites, right? Right? And then the sequential change of form, so something kind of growing. So something would grow at a rhythmic rate. Right? So rhythm is what sort of draws everything together. Right? It's the thing that links all the things together. Right? The problem with rhythm, though, is that if you have too much rhythm, right? Too much rhythm, it can be a bit boring. All right, so think about certain types of music, right? In certain types of music, if you have an overly repetitive beat, like certain types of club music, for example, right? If you have an overly repetitive beat that just keeps going on and on and on, people describe that as boring, right? That it's repetitive, right? So not always a good thing. Right? In addition, going hand in hand with that is contrast and or variation. So you talk about repetition, variation, right? Contrast is defined by different qualities or characteristics in a form. Interest is generated by using a variety of shapes, forms, textures, and so on. Right? So if you think about that, the variation are the changes, right? That make something more interesting. Right? Now here's the place where it works together. Now you go back to the music example. Right? If you have too much variation, right? If you have too much variation, things just sound chaotic. Right? So think about certain types of experimental punk rock from the 1980s. Some of it was just chaotic. Right? Some of it was brilliant, but some of it was just crazy and chaotic because there was too much variation and not enough repetition. Right? So on one side of the spectrum, you can have too much repetition. On the other side, you can have too much variation. But great works of art, right? Great works of music, whether it's Mozart or Metallica, great works of art have that right combination of repetitions and variations that make it interesting. I think that I think a great example of this is these guys. Yeah, the Minions. Right? Look at all of the repeated elements and then look at the variations. So the repetitions are their color, the fabric of the overalls that they're wearing, the shape of the eyepiece, right, is the same, but then you have these wonderful variations where some have one eye, some have two eyes, they all have hair, right, at least I think most of them have hair. They all have hair, but some of them only have a few sticking straight up, some of them are combed over, right, so some of them are a little bit larger, some of them are a little bit smaller, right, some of them are in the middle, right. That's a wonderful example of repetition variation that's working, and working, right, in a way, right, that leads us to the last two principles that we're going to focus on in this class, right? And those are harmony and unity, right? And a lot of times people use these terms kind of as the same, but there are subtle differences to them, and it's kind of important. So harmony is accomplished by the repetition of particular design elements, right? Harmony creates the sense of unity. Right? So it's the repetitions that we were just talking about, right, that cause, that harmonize a piece, that bring it all together. Right? But like I said, you got to be careful about overusing the repetitions. Unity in design occurs when the elements in a space work together. Right? Unity is the resolution. Right? It's the totality. So the principle that we're going after, right, is unity. Right? We want a unified composition. We want a unified composition, whether we're talking about a drawing, whether we're talking about a sculpture, whether we're talking about a photograph, whether we're talking about a Pixar or a DreamWorks animation. Right? We seek unification, right? The resolution of all the bits, of all the parts, as the final outcome. Right? Nobody wants an unresolved artwork. Right? Nobody wants an ununified composition. Right? Now, what it takes to unify, right, a work of art, well, that's understanding all of the previous things. Right? So that concludes my discussion of elements and principles of design. This week is all we're doing is a discussion board, so I'm going to ask you to go log on and check out the discussion board, and we're going to be looking at some examples from you guys. All right? Talk to you on Monday.